Hello and welcome to videos. That's what I do. I'm not going to be here long. Recently, I got the opportunity to interview Keith Huntington Derrick, who is a PhD student at Georgia State University in America. He's doing his PhD on asexual characters in literature and on asexual literature theory, and we did a Skype interview, which we organised after having met at the Asexuality conference in Edinburgh a couple of months ago. So in the end, we got about an hour, 15 minutes of footage. I think I'm not going to release it all as one video. So this is just the first part of 4 of that interview slash conversation.
Well, if you start, like you said, just by introducing yourself, that's
Sure.
probably the best way.
Well, my name is Keith Huntington Derrick. I am a PhD student at Georgia State University in Atlanta, Georgia. And you and I met at the UK Asexuality Conference, where I was invited to present my research. And that's one of the things I'm here to talk about today. I've written 3 books. I run my own website, and I'm trying to get this research off the ground involving asexual literary theory.
Yes. And unfortunately, we did record most of the ACE conference, but we lost the footage from your session. And I wasn't actually able to be there because I was at the registration desk. So that was a bit unfortunate. But hopefully we can go over some of the stuff you covered in your presentation and then see where it goes from there, I suppose. So if you'd like to give, I guess, a more detailed view of your research, I suppose.
Sure. Well, it's in asexual literary theory, similar to queer theory or gay and lesbian literary theory or African American literary theory. The idea is that you have this identity that is underrepresented. It's a marginalized community, and throughout history, that particular community has not been a focus of the literature or the studies. Now, unlike African American literature and feminist literature, asexual literature has a very unique obstacle to overcome. And that is the fact that prior to the Kinsey studies in the 50s, there was really no identification for asexuals. It was not really a thing. That's not to say that there were not asexuals. That's not to say that there were not people who were aromantic. Just the concept of a spectrum between allosexual and asexual, just that no one had really considered that. And that's probably the biggest obstacle to overcome. Post Kinsey studies, there are plenty of asexual characters in literature. In fact, contemporary literature, I don't know if you're a fan of young adult literature, but there's kind of been an explosion of ace characters in young adult fiction lately. But my goal is to focus on pre-Kinsey studies literature and to try and find characters that existed prior to the Kinsey studies who we could identify as asexual. And, there are certain steps that we have to go through in order to do that.
Okay. So from what I understand, the Kinsey studies was a series of, studies around sexuality, and Kinsey identified some people in an X category, if I understand correctly, which was
Yes.
They don't feel sexual attraction, essentially asexuality, but it didn't have that name at the time. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Kinsey's initial study was designed to, he wanted to place people on a spectrum between homosexual and heterosexual. And he often would find that, very few people were strictly on one end of the spectrum or strictly on the other. They always fell somewhere in between. But then he also found this sort of outlier data where people wouldn't be on one end, they wouldn't be on the other, and they wouldn't be anywhere in the middle. So he just kind of created this X category. And eventually, as the studies continued, the spectrum became the triangle. So the upside down triangle that we are familiar with today as a symbol of the LGBTQIA community, that is the Kinsey scale. Because top left was the purely homosexual, top right was purely heterosexual, and then at the bottom was asexual. And so you would fall somewhere on that triangle. So that was the ultimate effect of the Kinsey studies. And now we have terms like allosexual and demisexual and pansexual, and it just the plethora of terminology for sexual and romantic orientation just seems to be growing every day.
Yes, definitely. I think it helps people to have some term they can identify with, whether it be very specific or just general. But it was interesting you mentioned, or you drew analogs to queer literature and, well, representation of queer people in literature and that of ethnic minorities as well. I was wondering whether, if you look at the development of that representation, whether there is a parallel between them in how they're, I guess, seen in society and then how they're represented in literature.
There's a fundamental parallel. Studies have concluded that people that read more frequently, they tend to be more empathetic. So people who read regularly, they're more empathetic. And the reason being is because literature offers us an opportunity to not necessarily walk in the shoes of someone else, but get someone else's perspective on an issue. So let's take, for example, feminist literary theory. There were works of literature that were regarded very poorly until feminist literary theory came about. So Christina Rossetti, who's arguably one of the greatest poets of her time, she was not very highly regarded. But now that feminist literary theory has sort of evolved, and one of the processes of generating new literary theory is that you go back and you reread old works through that lens. And you kind of, you don't appropriate a work, but you discover it in a new way. So Christina Rossetti's Goblin Market, for example, was just considered a poem that was a children's story, but in reality, it's a early work of feminist literature involving sexual agency and rape and things like that. And it just, because you read it through the lens of feminist literary theory, it suddenly becomes this amazing work that is highly regarded. And it becomes part of the literary canon that is now taught in schools today. So children are going to be reading this in school. Undergrads are going to be reading it in their literature classrooms, and that helps promote empathy toward women's issues. That, I think, would be a corollary, a similar effect that we could get in the ACE community, because the biggest problem facing the ACE community is, well, it's in the name AVEN, visibility and education. Like, people don't even know we're a thing. I didn't realize that asexuality was a thing until I was close to 30.
Yeah.
So it's just that is mind-boggling to me now. So if we had a sort of literary representation in media or movies, anything, that would help people identify that, hey, I identify with this character. Why do I feel this way? Why do I feel or don't feel, in a lot of cases, the same way as my peers? And it would also allow an opportunity for those peers who are not a part of the asexual community to kind of understand that this is not something that's abnormal. It's not a phase. It's who people are.
Yes, actually, I have I don't know if you saw it when you looked at my channel, but I have a series where I was looking at asexual representation in television. So I was just watching some representation and commenting on it. And one of the things that always comes up when I talk about that is that if asexuality really, at the moment, the only way you can get exposure to it is either being part of the LGBT plus community or searching for it, looking for it on the internet. Whereas if there would be more representation in literature, in media in general, then you could come across it by accident and then relate to that because of it. And I think that's why it's so important that films, popular media, all the stuff like that include this representation, because it can help people who maybe won't have been exposed to it because they're in a more conservative environment realize something about themselves that they didn't know.
Yeah, it's an invaluable resource, I think. I remember growing up, I grew up in the Deep South, and they're not often the most progressive and forward-thinking of people. And I remember my sixth grade sex ed class. That was the first time we had any sexual education whatsoever. And I remember walking in and sitting down, and this teacher, this man that I really respected, taking everyone aside and saying, "Look, there are two kinds of people in this world. There are straight people who are attracted to the opposite sex, and then there are fags. And if you aren't attracted to someone of the opposite sex, you are a fag." This is an educator in a sex ed classroom saying that to impressionable children, and just asexuality wasn't even a part of the conversation. In his mind, I assume that asexual would also be. It's horrifying, because even if the teacher isn't teaching a work as having an asexual character in it, just by virtue of that asexual character being in the work allows for some form of representation. It's almost seditious in that way. It sneaks in under the radar. In a lot of ways. For example, Huckleberry Finn, which is fairly controversial. It has a black slave portrayed, by the standards of the literature at the time anyway, somewhat positively, which was shocking for someone who is used to reading slaves portrayed as subservient and less than. But the fact is, the narrative doesn't necessarily revolve around that character. You could conceivably teach Huckleberry Finn and not mention the racial aspect of it. But the fact that it's there is useful. Yeah,
definitely. I think it kind of plants a seed in your head as well. If you're exposed to that, even if it's a small bit of representation, you're kind of more open to the idea of that happening in real life, to that attitude in real life. It's something that just popped into my mind when you're talking about, obviously, education and teaching about minority sexualities. I don't know if you heard about the protests going on in Birmingham for like the whole year, essentially.
About they were teaching LGBT aspects in the sexual education curriculum, correct?
Yeah, essentially, they introduced these books to primary school children, which taught about different family structures. So that could be single parents, that could be two gay dads, it could be anything really, and also some gender identity. But it's taught in a way where they're children's books, so it's like a boy wants to wear dresses or something, or there's two male penguins raising a chick, and then there's been all these protests around it, and it's horrible. But yeah. I didn't have anywhere to go with that really. I just wanted to vent.
That's a very real and important topic. Don't know if I've mentioned this before, but I used to teach high school, and when I was a student teacher, part of the training was I had to sit in on a sex ed class, and there is in the South there's a very common sort of belief that sexual education should not occur before a certain age at all. There should be no sex education before a certain age. And two, it should only be abstinence-only sex education. It should only promote what they would call traditional relationships, which is just insulting in and of itself. But in that environment, I remember sitting in on this sex ed class, and for a lot of these kids, it was their first time in a sexual education class. And I remember watching the face on this 13-year-old girl when she realized her uncle had been sexually abusing her entire life, and she just didn't know. Like, she was not aware that what they were doing was sexual in any way.
Yeah.
And so there she is in this classroom having this, what amounted to a psychotic break, because she did not have the appropriate education at a young age to recognize that what is happening to her is unacceptable. And just the notion that, oh, well, she shouldn't have had sexual education before then, so she wouldn't be able to recognize it, is absolutely heinous.
There's well, obviously, I can't do a direct comparison, but up until recently there was a law that you couldn't promote homosexuality in schools in the UK, which sounds quite similar to that. And I know in my sex education, it's not a teacher who's been trained in that. It's not a specific sex education teacher. It's just whoever your tutor is, whoever it was randomly assigned to you, who's going to teach you sex education. So they feel awkward, the children feel awkward, and you don't really get taught anything valuable. I think the only thing I can really remember is putting a condom on a banana.
Well, that in and of itself is valuable. There are school districts in the United States where they aren't allowed to even mention the word condom. They're not allowed to. So teachers have to come up with really creative ways to get around that. And one teacher took a sock and rolled it up like a packaged condom in a Ziploc bag. Yeah. And he put it. I'm going to show you in this sex ed class how to put this sock on your foot. And so he takes the sock and he's putting it on his foot. And like, that's how you put on a sock in a sex ed class. And it was just so clever, because he completely got around the agenda of some of these people trying to force their beliefs on others. But yeah, there's in the state just north of Georgia, in Tennessee, there's a law. Teachers are mandatory reporters. So if there's something that falls under that list of things that they're supposed to report to the law or a parent, they have to report that. And one of the things in Tennessee is if they suspect a student is gay, they mandatorily have to report that to the parent. So they are legally required to out a student.
That's just horrible.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if that's still the case, but that was the case a couple of years ago. I'd hope that some court somewhere would shoot that down as unconstitutional, but I really don't know.
If you enjoyed this and want to see the other parts of the interview, I'll be putting the other videos in the description and in a playlist. So if you want to watch the whole of it, then feel free. If you enjoyed this video, then please leave a like. I post videos every Saturday, so if you want to see more, then feel free to subscribe. That is all I had to say today. Have a wonderful day, and I shall see you next time.